When you picture a classroom in the Middle Ages, what comes to mind? Perhaps a dusty hall with chanting monks, or a stern master with a rod in hand. But what did children actually study? What lessons filled their days, and how did those long hours of memorization shape the world that came after? Tonight, we'll step quietly into the daily routines of medieval schooling, from the cold stone benches of monastery schools to the growing universities of Europe, and uncover the surprisingly ordinary subjects that prepared children not for glory, but for survival. Stay with me until the end, and you may find that the forgotten details of medieval classrooms are far more important than they first appear. Chapter 1. The Monastic Roots of Learning. When you imagine the Middle Ages, your thoughts might drift first to castles, knights, and peasants working in the fields. But hidden behind thick stone walls and beneath the dim glow of oil lamps, another world quietly flourished, the world of learning. Education in the Middle Ages was not widespread. It was not easily accessible, and for most children, it did not exist at all. Yet for those who were fortunate enough to step inside a school, the experience was entirely different from what you and I know today. To understand the beginnings of medieval education, you must first look to the monasteries. Long before villages began to build schools of their own, monasteries were the heart of learning. They were places where men, and in some cases, women, withdrew from worldly life to dedicate themselves to God, but their devotion did not stop at prayer. Monasteries were centers of preservation. Monks carefully copied texts, letter by letter, onto parchment. Without them, many ancient works from Greece and Rome would have been lost forever. Imagine then, a child entering a monastery to begin his education. His day would start before dawn, not with the ringing of a school bell, but with the tolling of the monastery's bell calling the community to prayer. This was the rhythm of life: prayer, work, and study, woven together in strict routine. The child's first lessons were simple. He would learn his letters, but not in the way modern children learn with colorful books or playful songs. Instead, his alphabet was introduced through the Psalms. To learn to read was in the Middle Ages to learn the sacred words of Scripture. This connection between education and religion was absolute. Literacy was not taught for personal enrichment or to inspire imagination. It was taught so that children could understand the Bible, memorize prayers, and participate in the liturgy. The thought of education as something separate from faith simply did not exist. The setting of these lessons was austere. Picture a long wooden bench in a cold stone room. The students, mostly boys, sat in silence while the master, often a monk himself, recited passages in Latin. The children repeated after him, their voices rising and falling together like a chant. Latin was the language of the church, of scripture, and of learning. Even if the children spoke only a local dialect at home, every lesson at school was given in Latin. This made education doubly challenging, because before they could even begin to grasp the meaning of their lessons, the students had to learn an entirely new language. Writing was another essential skill, though again, it was not taught in the way you might expect. Pens were not neat metal nibs but sharpened quills. Paper, as you know it, did not yet exist. Instead, parchment, treated animal skin, was the surface for writing. It was expensive and valuable, and mistakes could not be wasted. Students practiced letters on wooden tablets covered with wax, scratching with a stylus, erasing, and rewriting until the shapes became familiar. Only then, when they had gained skill, would they move on to ink and parchment. The early curriculum was narrow, but it was demanding. Reading, writing, and memorization formed the foundation. Children memorized prayers, passages from the Psalms, and even full books of the Bible. For centuries, rote memorization was the primary method of learning. Knowledge was stored not in shelves of books, but in the minds of the students themselves. To remember was to know. Outside of the monastery, education was much less common. Most village children did not go to school at all. Instead, they learned the skills of survival, how to plow fields, tend animals, or spin wool. For these children, literacy was unnecessary. Yet, in some villages, small schools began to appear. These were often connected to parish churches, and their purpose remained the same as that of the monasteries: to teach children to read the scriptures and participate in the religious life of the community. Imagine such a village school. A single room, perhaps attached to the church itself, with wooden benches, little light, and a master who was not a professional teacher, but a cleric or priest. The students might be a handful of boys from local families, sitting together with their wax tablets. Lessons were long and repetitive, and discipline was strict. The master carried a rod, and punishment was swift for mistakes. Silence was demanded, attention was expected, and progress was measured not in creativity, but in obedience. Despite these challenges, education in monasteries and village schools slowly began to spread. It was not yet common, but it was growing. Parents who could afford it sometimes sent their children to these schools, not to prepare them for worldly success, but to ensure their souls were safe. Education was seen as a spiritual safeguard. Yet here lies the question that lingers as this first section ends. If education in the Middle Ages began so narrowly, tied so closely to the church and scripture, how did it grow into something larger? How did it expand beyond monasteries and parish schools, eventually giving rise to the great universities of Europe? Chapter 2. The Curriculum of the Middle Ages: What Children Learned. When you think of school in the Middle Ages, your mind might wander toward images of dusty manuscripts, quills scratching faintly across parchment, and a monk gently guiding rows of children who sat in long wooden benches. But beyond the surface, the actual curriculum, the substance of what medieval children studied, was highly structured and rooted in traditions that had already existed for centuries. To you today, this might sound like a dry list of subjects, and in truth, much of it was. Yet these dull details shaped the intellectual foundations of Europe for hundreds of years, ensuring that the ideas of Rome and Greece survived long after the empires themselves had crumbled. Let's begin with the framework most medieval schools adhered to: the trivium and the quadrivium. These two sets of studies, first described in late antiquity, became the pillars of medieval education, handed down through monasteries, cathedral schools, and eventually universities. The trivium was the beginner's stage, consisting of grammar, rhetoric, and logic. The quadrivium represented more advanced learning: arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy. Together, they made up the 7 liberal arts, regarded as the essential preparation for further study in theology, law, or medicine. Grammar, the root of all study. Grammar in the medieval sense did not simply mean learning the rules of language. It was considered the foundational art of learning how to read, interpret, and eventually produce correct Latin. Latin was the lifeblood of the medieval classroom. Children did not study their native tongue, whether French, English, German, or Italian. Those languages were seen as vulgar, unfit for scholarship. Instead, boys, and in rare cases, girls, were drilled in Latin declensions, conjugations, and vocabulary. They memorized lines of classical authors, often without much understanding, until they could repeat them back in proper form. Daily lessons might include the reading of Donatus, a Roman grammarian whose textbooks had survived through the centuries. Students would chant declensions in unison: puella, pueleo, pueleo, puella, a rhythm echoing off the stone walls of the classroom. At times, the lessons could be grueling, as teachers expected near-perfect memorization. Parchment was expensive, so copying exercises were done sparingly. Much of the training relied on memory and oral repetition. For you listening now, you might find this tedious, and in truth, it was. But grammar in Latin was more than a subject. It was the entry point into all learning. Only with mastery of Latin could a student progress to other areas of study: rhetoric, the art of speaking well. Once a student had enough Latin to form sentences and understand texts, the focus shifted to rhetoric. Medieval society placed great value on speech, not only for the church but also for courts, councils, and negotiations. A well-trained speaker could persuade, instruct, and inspire, while a poorly trained one might be dismissed or ignored. Students practice composing speeches, letters, and arguments, drawing examples from Cicero and other Roman masters. They learned not just the content, but the form, the structure of an introduction, the way to present an argument, and the means of appealing to the listener's emotions. In the monastery schools, rhetoric was often framed as a tool for preaching. But in cathedral schools or urban centers, it prepared boys for administrative service in a bishop's chancery or even for royal courts. The process was rarely thrilling. Students copied examples endlessly, dissecting each sentence to understand its effect. Yet slowly, through practice, they acquired a skill that was crucial in a world where public speaking was one of the few ways to demonstrate learning and authority. Logic, the path of reason. The final part of the trivium was logic, sometimes called dialectic. This was the study of reasoning, and in the medieval classroom, it was often introduced through simple exercises in argument. Teachers posed questions, and students had to answer, defend, or refute them using precise rules of reasoning. This practice was more than a mental exercise. It prepared students for theological debate, which would become a central feature of higher education. A boy who mastered logic could defend a point of doctrine, challenge a heretical idea, or argue about the interpretation of Scripture. Even at the elementary level, the seeds of this intellectual training were planted through structured debates and careful exercises. For you, listening now, this may sound dry, even repetitive. But remember, the medieval student did not see these as optional or ornamental. They were the basic skills that would allow him to rise through society, whether into the church, the law, or even the bureaucracy of a king. The quadrivium, mathematics and the cosmos. Once the trivium was completed, students, if they advanced, moved on to the quadrivium. Here the subjects shifted from language to number, from the structure of words to the structure of the universe. Arithmetic was the simplest, focusing on the properties of numbers and their relationships. This was not the arithmetic of modern classrooms with endless drills in addition and subtraction. Rather, it involved more abstract thinking about the nature of numbers. Drawn from ancient sources like Boethius, geometry too was not the hands-on study of shapes and measurements that you may remember from school. It was deeply theoretical, rooted in Euclid's writings, and concerned with understanding the logical principles of space and form. Students rarely measured real-world objects. Instead, they read and recited proofs, learning them as intellectual exercises. Music, perhaps surprisingly, was considered a mathematical science. It was not taught as performance, though many students sang in choirs, but as the study of ratios, harmony, and the ordering of sounds. The medieval mind believed that the same principles that ordered musical harmony also governed the cosmos. Finally, astronomy introduced students to the movements of the heavens. Again, this was not practical stargazing, but a study of the patterns and cycles described in classical texts. The sky was seen as a reflection of divine order, and to understand it was to come closer to understanding God's creation. The daily rhythm of school, beyond the subjects themselves. Daily life in a medieval school had a rhythm that was almost monastic. Students often rose early, attending morning prayers before lessons. The classroom might be a simple chamber near the church or monastery, with benches, a lectern, and little else. Light was scarce in winter months, so classes depended on daylight hours. Discipline was strict, sometimes harsh. Teachers expected silence, obedience, and diligence. A student who failed to memorize a lesson or who misbehaved might be punished physically, as was common across society. Meals were simple, often bread and broth, taken quickly before returning to lessons. The pace of study was slow, deliberate, and repetitive. Each day resembled the last, filled with recitation, copying, and long hours of listening to the master read aloud from a text. To us now, it may feel monotonous, But it was precisely this slow, steady accumulation of knowledge that preserved ancient learning and transmitted it across centuries. Girls and education. Most schools catered to boys, particularly those destined for clerical service. Yet some girls, especially from wealthy or noble families, did receive instruction. Convent schools sometimes taught reading, writing, and religious devotion. Noble girls might also learn household management, estate administration, and in rare cases, the liberal arts. However, such opportunities were limited, and the majority of girls remained excluded from the structured curriculum of the trivium and quadrivium. For those girls who did learn, the emphasis was less on abstract study and more on practical literacy, enough to read prayers, manage accounts, or correspond with family members. Yet even this limited access meant that a handful of women emerged as writers, poets, and scholars, contributing to medieval intellectual life in ways that might otherwise have been impossible. A foundation for the future. All of these subjects, dry as they might sound, formed the foundation for the higher learning that would flourish in the later Middle Ages at universities in Paris, Bologna, and Oxford. But even in the small village school or the monastery classroom, the seeds of that tradition were being planted. Boys chanting Latin verbs, copying lines from Cicero, or struggling through a logical puzzle were unknowingly part of a much larger story, the transmission of knowledge across centuries. And yet, as the lessons ended each day, and the students filed out to return to their lodgings or to their duties in the monastery, questions lingered. Was this education truly shaping their minds for independent thought? Or was it simply a method of repetition and memorization, ensuring conformity? Did medieval schools foster creativity, or did they stifle it beneath the weight of rote learning? Chapter 3. The Long Road from Classroom to Life. By the time a medieval child completed his schooling, whether at a monastery, a cathedral school, or later in a university, the knowledge he had gathered was more than a collection of memorized Latin phrases or half-understood mathematical theories. Education in the Middle Ages carried immense weight, not just for personal advancement, but for the structure of society itself. To you today, this may sound grand, but it was in fact grounded in very ordinary outcomes. Most students were not destined for fame or renown. Instead, their schooling shaped the small, steady functions of society, the copying of records, the running of estates, the service of the church, or the management of guilds. The church is the great employer. For the majority of educated boys, the most direct path from the classroom led into the church. Monastic and cathedral schools existed primarily to train clerics, after all, and literacy was in high demand. A boy who had mastered Latin grammar could serve as a scribe, copying manuscripts, letters, or legal documents. This was not glamorous work, but it was steady, and it carried prestige because literacy itself was a rare skill. From the ranks of scribes, some advanced to become notaries, secretaries to bishops, or even members of a royal chancery. Their schooling in rhetoric and logic prepared them for administrative roles, where they drafted charters, settled disputes, or managed correspondence. For others, schooling led to pastoral duties, preaching, teaching, and guiding parish communities. The daily life of such a cleric was far removed from the excitement of battles or courtly intrigue. Instead, it was filled with long hours of copying texts, balancing accounts, or reading scripture aloud to those who could not read. In this sense, the dull discipline of the classroom directly mirrored the tasks of adult life. Slow, repetitive, but essential, pathways beyond the church. Though the church remained dominant, not all educated boys took holy orders. In cities and towns, education opened doors to secular careers. Municipal governments needed clerks who could record transactions, keep tax registers, or manage civic correspondence. Nobles needed stewards who could read estate records, calculate rents, and manage tenant disputes. Merchants sought educated assistants to maintain accounts or handle contracts in Latin, which served as the international language of business and law. Guilds, too, benefited from literacy. While the average craftsman might not read or write, guild leaders often did, relying on clerically trained men to handle their charters and rules. Even legal disputes ranging from land boundaries to inheritance required educated minds who could parse old documents and frame persuasive arguments. In this way, the medieval curriculum, rooted in ancient grammar and rhetoric, translated into the practical fabric of society. It was not about personal enlightenment, but about the preservation of order. The role of universities. By the 12th century, a new institution emerged that reshaped the trajectory of education: the university. Students who completed their schooling and wished to advance further traveled to centers like Paris, Bologna, or Oxford. There, they pursued advanced studies in theology, law, or medicine, each building upon the trivium and quadrivium. For theology, logic and rhetoric became tools for interpreting scripture and defending doctrine. For law, grammar and reasoning were essential in analyzing Roman and canon law. For medicine, arithmetic and astronomy played roles in calculating treatments, understanding the humors, and determining auspicious times for healing. The daily grind of a university student was not so different from his earlier schooling lectures, debates, and long hours of copying texts, but the stakes were higher. A degree in law or medicine could bring both wealth and influence, while theology represented the pinnacle of scholarly pursuit. Girls and limited outcomes. For girls, as mentioned in earlier sections, opportunities were far narrower. Those who received education often remained within convents, applying their literacy to devotional reading, hymn composition, or letter writing. A few noble women used their training to manage estates, issue charters, or patronize writers and artists. In exceptional cases, women like Hildegard of Bingen emerged as scholars, composers, and visionaries. Yet these were rare exceptions, and most women's education was confined to practical literacy, domestic management, or piety. The slow transformation of society over time. The spread of schooling reshaped medieval society in subtle ways. The reliance on written records grew, replacing oral tradition. Villages and towns began to depend on clerks for keeping accounts and maintaining charters. Kings required armies of educated administrators to govern expanding realms. Even the church itself became more structured, with educated clergy enforcing uniform practices across distant regions. In a sense, the dull chant of Latin declensions in a village schoolroom echoed all the way up to the corridors of royal courts and papal councils. The repetitive exercises in grammar formed the foundation of documents that governed kingdoms. The memorized speeches of Cicero laid the groundwork for sermons that spread across Europe. The abstract puzzles of logic prepared minds for the great theological disputes that would dominate the late Middle Ages. The human side of education, yet amid these structural roles, it is worth pausing to consider the human experience of medieval schooling. Imagine a boy in a cold classroom, struggling to remember a passage of Latin, anxious under the stern gaze of his master. Or a young clerk hunched over a dimly lit desk, painstakingly copying each letter of a charter, knowing that a mistake might render it void. Or a girl in a convent, tracing prayers in her psalter, her learning confined to devotion, but nonetheless shaping her spiritual world. These lives were not glamorous, nor are they often remembered in history books, but they carried the knowledge of centuries forward, ensuring that ancient texts survived and that society continued to function. In their monotony, they built the foundations of the modern world. Reflections. Looking back, you may ask, was medieval schooling a success? It preserved ancient knowledge, produced literate clergy and administrators, and laid the groundwork for universities and scholarship. But it was also rigid, focused on memorization, and limited in scope. It privileged Latin over native languages, tradition over innovation. Did it stifle creativity even as it preserved knowledge? Or did it provide the discipline and structure necessary for civilization to advance? That question remains open, just as it must have felt open to the medieval students themselves, wondering how their endless drills and recitations might one day shape their lives And that brings us to the end of our quiet journey through the classrooms of the Middle Ages. I hope this gentle look at what children studied so long ago has helped you drift into a calm and restful state. Here at Quiet Boring Sleep, I'll always be here to share more soft, uneventful stories from history to help ease your mind. If you enjoyed this moment of stillness, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. It's a small gesture, but it helps keep these calm stories going. Thank you for listening, and may your night be peaceful.